I know that title stopped you. Good. Because what I am about to say is going to challenge something that many of you have believed your entire lives. And I want to be clear from the very first sentence. I am not telling you to stop praying. I am not telling you that God does not hear you. I am not telling you that prayer is worthless. I am telling you something far more precise and far more useful than any of that. I am telling you that the way most people pray for money is actively working against them. That the specific posture, the specific language, the specific inner state that most people bring to the moment they ask God for financial help is, and I say this with deep respect and genuine love, the posture of someone who will not receive what they are asking for. Not because God is not listening, but because they are asking in a way that the ancient Jewish wisdom tradition specifically identified over 2,000 years ago as a form of prayer that closes the channel rather than opens it. And today I am going to show you exactly what that means, exactly why it happens, and exactly what to do instead. This is the teaching that changed more financial lives in my 37 years of work than almost any other. Pay attention. Let me ask you something. When you pray for money, and if you are watching this video, you have prayed for money, because everyone who is human and in financial difficulty has prayed for money. What does that prayer feel like on the inside? What is the emotional texture of it? For most people, if they are honest, the prayer for money feels like this: urgent, desperate, tinged with fear, accompanied by an awareness of what is lacking, what is overdue, what is about to run out. The prayer arises from scarcity and is saturated in the feeling of scarcity. And the person praying brings to that prayer an inner state of contraction, of smallness, of need, of the particular vulnerability that comes from feeling financially exposed and afraid. They pray hard. They pray sincerely. They may pray for a long time, and they receive nothing. Or something small arrives briefly and then is gone. And they conclude that either God did not hear, or God heard and chose not to help, or, and this is the most damaging conclusion of all, that they personally are not the kind of person whose prayers get answered. None of those conclusions are correct. The prayer was heard. The channel was closed by the very quality of consciousness the prayer was offered from. And this is precisely what the tradition predicted. My name is Rabbi Naomi. For 37 years, I have studied and taught within a lineage that traces its roots through the great Hasidic masters, through the Baal Shem Tov, through the school of the Maggid of Mezrich, through the later development of the Musar tradition, and its integration with the practical dimensions of Jewish law and Kabbalistic teaching. I came to this specific understanding, the understanding of why certain prayers for financial help consistently fail and what to do about it, through a text I encountered at the age of 31, studying in a small women's yeshiva in the north of Israel, in a room that smelled of old books and pine trees, and something I can only describe as the particular stillness of a place where serious learning has been happening for a very long time. The text was a collection of responsa from the 18th century, and buried in a section on the laws of prayer was a teaching attributed to one of the early Hasidic masters that I have never forgotten. It said in essence, the person who prays from hunger never receives food. Only the person who prays from the knowledge that the table is already set receives the meal. I sat with that sentence for 3 days before I understood it. When I understood it, everything I had been doing in my work with people and money changed. Before I take you into the framework, I want to tell you about a woman named Hannah. She was 61 years old, a retired school teacher, a genuinely devout woman who had prayed every day of her adult life without interruption. She was also, when she came to me, in serious financial difficulty. Not poverty, but the specific anxiety of someone who can see clearly that the trajectory of their savings is moving in the wrong direction and cannot find a way to stop it. She had been praying for financial relief for nearly 4 years, consistently, sincerely, with real faith and real effort, and nothing had changed. She was not bitter about it. She was too devout for bitterness. But she was confused in a way that had begun to erode something important in her. Because if God heard her prayers, and she believed completely that God heard her prayers, then why was nothing moving? She sat across from me on a warm September afternoon, the windows of my study open to the sound of the street below, and she said to me, "Rabbi Naomi, I have done everything I was taught to do. I pray, I give tzedakah, I try to live rightly. Why does the money not come?" And I said to her, "Hannah, I believe you completely. I believe that you pray and give and live rightly. And I want to ask you one question. When you pray for money, what do you feel?" She thought about it. She said, "I feel how much I need it." I said, "And there is your answer." The framework I am going to share with you is built on a distinction that the Kabbalistic tradition makes with great precision. A distinction between two modes of relationship with the divine that produce completely different results in the material world. The first mode is called ratzo, running, reaching, striving, the movement of a soul toward the divine from a place of longing and lack. The second mode is called shov, returning, resting, dwelling, the movement of a soul that has already, in some sense, arrived. Both modes are necessary. Both are described in the tradition as authentic and valid forms of spiritual engagement, but they are not interchangeable. And when it comes to prayer for abundance specifically, the tradition is very clear. Prayer offered from the ratzo state, from reaching, from urgency, from the consciousness of not yet having, closes the receiving channel. Prayer offered from the shov state, from a place of prior arrival, of already dwelling in the reality of what is being asked for, opens it. This is the teaching the Hasidic master was pointing toward, with the image of the table already set. The person who receives the meal is not the person who prays in desperation because they are hungry. The person who receives the meal is the person who prays from the knowledge, not the hope, not the wish, but the knowledge that the table has already been set, that the abundance already exists in the spiritual realm, and that the prayer is not a request to create something from nothing, but an act of alignment with something that is already real and waiting to descend. This distinction sounds, at first hearing, like a semantic game. It is not a semantic game. It is a description of two completely different inner states that produce two completely different relationships with the divine flow of abundance. And moving from one to the other, from the ratzo of desperate asking to the shov of grounded receiving, is the specific work that I have seen transform people's financial lives more reliably than any other single practice I teach. Now, I want to be precise about what this does not mean. It does not mean pretending you are not in difficulty. It does not mean performing gratitude you do not feel. It does not mean bypassing the reality of your situation with a spiritual technique designed to make you feel better about something that is genuinely painful. This is the behavior of someone who has misunderstood the teaching. And I want to say that clearly, because I have seen that misunderstanding cause real harm. The shov state is not a feeling you manufacture. It is a knowing you build. And the tradition provides specific practices for building it. Practices grounded not in positive thinking, but in theology, in the actual structure of reality as the sages understood it. Specifically, in the teaching that the Ari, Rabbi Yitzchak Luria, developed at great length, that everything that belongs to a person's life is already present in the higher worlds. Their parnasa, their divinely appointed portion of abundance, is not something that needs to be created. It is something that needs to be received. It is already there. It has always been there. The only question is whether the channel between the higher world where it exists and the lower world where the person lives is open enough for it to descend. And prayer offered from scarcity consciousness, from the rutso of urgent asking, tends to narrow that channel rather than widen it. Hannah and I worked together for 5 months. The first thing I changed was not her prayer. The first thing I changed was what she did for 10 minutes before her prayer. I assigned her a practice drawn from the Hasidic tradition of hisbonenus, deep, structured contemplation, in which she would spend those 10 minutes not asking for anything, but dwelling. Dwelling in the knowledge that the abundance she needed already existed. Not as wishful thinking, as theology, as a structured meditation on the actual Kabbalistic teaching that her portion was already set, already designated, already waiting. I asked her to feel, not to imagine, but genuinely to feel, even for 30 seconds of those 10 minutes, what it would be like to be the person who has already received. Not the relief, not the excitement, just the settledness. The ordinary, unspectacular settledness of a person for whom the financial question has been answered, and who is now simply living their life. That settledness is the shove state. That is the state from which the tradition instructs that prayer for abundance must arise. Within 6 weeks, Hannah told me that something in her prayer had changed. She could not fully describe what, but it felt different from the inside, less effortful, less urgent, more, she searched for the word, more like a conversation than a petition. By the end of the 4th month, a financial situation that had been blocked for 3 years began to move. An asset she had been unable to liquidate found a buyer. An inheritance dispute that had been unresolved for 2 years resolved in her favor. I observed these outcomes and I was not surprised. I have seen this pattern repeat too many times to be surprised. I was, as I always am in these moments, simply grateful. The practice itself, the 10-minute hisbonenus before prayer, has 3 specific components, and I want to give them to you precisely. The first is what I call the descent into knowing. You sit quietly and you bring to mind, not as a wish but as a fact, the Kabbalistic teaching that your abundance already exists. You do not have to believe this emotionally. You are simply choosing to hold it as the operating premise of the next 10 minutes, the way a scientist holds a hypothesis as operating truth during an experiment. The second component is the dwelling. You allow yourself to rest, briefly, in the felt sense of already having. Not abundance as fantasy, not yachts and mansions and extravagance, just the ordinary settled feeling of enough. Enough to cover what needs to be covered, enough to stop the anxiety, enough to allow a full breath. Find that feeling even for a moment and stay with it. The third component is the gratitude that arises naturally from dwelling, rather than the gratitude that is performed as a spiritual technique. There is a profound difference between these two things, and the body knows the difference immediately. Performed gratitude feels effortful. Natural gratitude, which arises from genuinely touching the shove state even briefly, feels like exhaling after holding your breath. That exhalation is the opening of the channel. And prayer offered from the open channel, prayer that rises not from the urgency of lack, but from the settled knowledge of divine provision, is prayer that the tradition says reaches the place it needs to reach and returns with what it was sent to retrieve. Now I need to prepare you for the experience of beginning this practice, because it will not feel the way you expect it to feel. In the first week, the 10 minutes of hisbonenus will likely feel impossible. Your mind will fill immediately with the practical problems, the bills, the numbers, the urgent material pressures that feel outrageous to be setting aside for 10 minutes when they are so present and so demanding. This is not failure. This is the ratso state asserting itself because it has been the dominant mode for a very long time and it does not yield quietly. Do not fight it. Simply name it. There is the urgency, and return, gently and without self-criticism, to the dwelling. The return itself is the practice, not the achieving of the state, the returning to it again and again, each time the urgency pulls you away. By the second week, the returns will come faster. By the third or fourth week, something in the 10 minutes will begin to open, and the prayer that follows will begin to feel different. Not dramatic, not ecstatic, different, quieter, more grounded, more like the conversation Hannah described. And what tends to follow that shift in the material dimensions of a person's life is movement. Real, measurable, sometimes surprising movement in the direction of the financial relief they have been praying for without receiving for months or years. The complete architecture of this teaching, the full Hisbonenus practice with its specific components and sequences, the extended Kabbalistic framework for understanding Parnassa and the mechanism of divine provision, the additional prayer practices the tradition assigns for different categories of financial need, the integration of this inner work with the practical and structural dimensions of financial life. All of that is contained in the program I have built called the Prosperity Letters. The link is in the description beneath this video. I built this program for people who have been praying sincerely and receiving nothing, and deserve to understand why and what to do instead. Hannah was not unusual. She was representative of thousands of devout, sincere, genuinely faithful people who have been taught the correct intention, but not the correct inner posture. The Prosperity Letters teaches the posture. Everything else in my experience tends to follow from that. Leave a comment below this video and tell me, honestly, which state you recognize in yourself when you pray for money. The razzo of urgent asking, or something closer to the shove of grounded receiving. There is no wrong answer. The comment is not a test. It is the beginning of the self-knowledge that this practice requires. And I respond to as many comments as I can, because this conversation is one I take seriously, and because your honesty in the comments helps this teaching reach the people who are sitting right now in exactly the confusion Hannah carried into my study. Faithful people who cannot understand why their prayers are not being answered, who have not yet been told that the answer was always in the quality of the asking. If this channel is new to you, I invite you to subscribe. Every week, I bring forward teachings from this tradition that are rarely accessible in the modern world. Teachings that have been preserved precisely because they work, across centuries and across every kind of human circumstance. Subscribe and let these teachings come to you steadily, because steadiness is itself a form of the shove state. A life that regularly returns to this source of wisdom is a life that is building something real. And if this video gave you something today, if the image of the table already set landed somewhere true in you, if the distinction between razzo and shove clarified something that has been confusing you for a long time, please press the like. Not as a favor to me, as your first practice of the shove state, as a small act of giving that does not arise from urgency or obligation, but from genuine recognition. That is what a like can be when it is offered with intention. Let it be that. May your prayer change this week, not in the words, in the posture. May you find, even for 30 seconds of the 10 minutes before you pray, the felt knowledge that what you need already exists and is already moving toward you through channels that do not require your anxiety to stay open. Channels that, in fact, open wider the moment your anxiety releases its grip on them. The table is already set. It has always been set. The only thing that was ever required of you was to sit down. Sit down now. The meal is coming. It was never as far away as it felt, and the one who set the table has been waiting with extraordinary patience for you to stop standing at the door asking whether there is food and simply walk in and take your place. There is one more thing I want to say before you go, and it is perhaps the most important thing in this entire video. The teaching I have shared today will be misunderstood by some people as a teaching about positive thinking. It is not a teaching about positive thinking. Positive thinking asks you to feel what you do not feel. The shove state asks something entirely different. It asks you to know what the tradition teaches is actually, objectively, theologically true. That your portion exists, that it is designated, that it is not contingent on your emotional state or your level of deservingness or the quality of your performance as a spiritual person. It is yours because it was given to you. Your only work is to stop blocking the channel through which it arrives. And the channel is blocked most reliably by the thing that feels most like faith, but is actually its opposite. The urgent, anxious, grasping quality of a prayer that does not yet trust the answer it is asking for. Real faith, in this tradition, does not grasp. Real faith rests. Real faith sits at the table that is already set and picks up the fork with the quiet confidence of someone who knows that the meal was prepared specifically for them, by a host who has never once failed to provide and who is not about to start now. That is the teaching. That is the posture. And that posture, practiced daily, built gradually, returned to again and again across the weeks of the Hisbonenus practice, is what changes not just how you pray, but who you are when you pray. And who you are when you pray determines everything that follows. Everything.